Professor James Gillam, you wrote your memoir about your time in Vietnam, 1969-1970, life and death in the Central Highlands. It's a great memoir, and it has some powerful passages in it, and other passages that maybe aren't powerful but are certainly memorable. The orangutan section, as an example of a very memorable passage. And so I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about your time there. But early on in the memoir, before you get to Vietnam, you're studying at university, and I discovered that one of the things you and I had in common is that when we started as university students, neither of us did very well, and we had to go through other things, and and got it together later on. Can you just tell us about just kind of maybe even just where you grew up, getting into school, and what was going on so that your early university experience didn't work out very well for you?
Sure. Middle class WASP education. And I wasn't very confident about myself as a student. As a matter of fact, I did not really intend to go to college until I spent the summer working a construction job. And I found out, I guess it was about mid-July, late July, when one of the other laborers on the crew died of a heat stroke.
Wow.
And I thought, you might want to do something different. And I had this application for Ohio University that had been filled out and sitting on my dresser at home.
Yeah.
I came home that day and I mailed it. And they accepted people until they were full up. And so I got in and I started in about mid-September of 1965.
Yeah.
I was really unprepared and unsure of how to be a good student, and I had no confidence at all in my ability. So I went from being on probation to not on probation, back and forth and back and forth, and acquired enough what they call deficiency points for bad grades. And so in the spring of, the end of the school year in 1968, I was dismissed from the university. But that period from January to, the start of the summer break in 1968 was critical. There was a lot going on in the political history of America at the time. Imagine, if you will, being on campus when Martin Luther King was shot.
Sure.
And imagine being there when Kennedy was shot. There was just social and political turmoil in America that spilled onto the campus.
Sure.
It was a really big distraction from even thinking about being a properly functioning student,
Sure.
Which I wasn't.
Right. And you mentioned the feeling that although it wasn't a formal resignation, it certainly looked like President Johnson resigned.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that. And so, what I'm hearing is you're a student who, maybe not really, the best prepared to be in university in the first place, in a cultural context where things just feel like they're coming unglued.
Yeah, well, the way the complications and distractions from Vietnam spilled into my life.
Yeah.
I like this. My brother was in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And he was in Vietnam
in
1967. And Ed went missing in action he got washed away crossing a river.
Yeah.
And, he was reported dead, and then he was reported missing in action. And he finally showed up at the Naval Hospital in Chicago.
Yeah,
So
he stumbled into an army group or something like that, if I remember correctly, or something
he
like
got washed away crossing a river.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was out there for a couple of weeks by himself, and a unit from the 1st Air Cav found him.
Right.
And he came back to America on a hospital ship. I believe it was called the Repose.
Propose, yeah.
And then they flew him to Chicago, and my family was notified. So I just dropped everything at school.
Yeah.
Got on the Greyhound bus and went to visit my brother in the hospital.
Yeah.
So, things like that just took me away from focusing on school, took me away from the campus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are a couple things about this situation with your brother that one of the things that you mention in the book, I'll ask you about that in a second. But one of the things that really surprised me, did the Marines, did they, there's just this policy, don't leave anybody behind, and the impression I have is your brother got swept away, and I'm sure they will look for him, in the immediate term, but it feels like he was just kind of like, oh, well, do you know, was there an effort really to go find him, or,
No, there was not. Now, in 1972, to a conference of veterans program directors, and I met a man who was running a veterans program in Miami. And he said, I knew a guy named Ed Gillam when I was in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And I said, that was my brother. And he said, I wish things had turned out differently. And he recounted the events of my brother getting lost there. Ed was in the field, and he had malaria and dysentery. He was pretty sick, but he washed away crossing one of the rivers up in I-Corps, the northern part of South.
Yeah.
And so this guy named Herb said, your brother got washed away, and the company commander was in a hurry, and he said, Gillam's gone. He picked another point man, and they just kept going.
Wow, that is incredible. It's such a breach of just that basic don't leave anybody behind. I guess the reason it strikes me is because I know a Marine vet who did everything he could to find a body, someone he knew was dead. He did everything he could to find a body. And, and he's been living with that for 50 years, just that he felt like he wasn't, despite everything, he wasn't successful in getting that. And it's just really hard for me to wrap my mind around a Marine officer just basically just saying, oh, well, let's just keep rolling.
By my experience, there were lots of times where people got left behind.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's something. Now,
I got left behind in a firefight. My machine gunner and his ammo bearers took off in the middle of a firefight and left me, my radio man, and one other sergeant. That happened because the machine gunner was a coward.
Is this Dover?
Yeah.
I was just reading about Dover yesterday.
Yeah. He picked up the gun and ran away in the middle of a firefight. And the ammunition bearers are trained to go wherever he goes with the machine gun. So when he took off and ran away, they followed him. And that meant that out of 10 or 11 people on my side in the firefight, the machine gunner was gone, and the 4 guys who carried ammunition for him and their rifles were gone. And so me and the other sergeant and my radio man were left there by ourselves. And
Now, is this the incident where afterwards you had a little chit chat with Dover and
I did.
Your 45 came out and you sort of sent the message?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't have that conversation with him right then, not that day. A couple days later, he messed up again, and he got one person killed and got another man shot up pretty badly. And so that was when I just kind of took him aside and hinted that if he screwed up again, he wasn't going to go home. He was getting people killed.
But if I remember right, there was another incident after that, and then after that firefight, another guy had his helmet off and was beating the mess out of Dover.
Yeah, well, that was
my chronology, right?
That was the same. That was the same day.
Okay.
And, I had a talk with him. Let me put these incidents in order.
Yeah.
In mid-February, Dover ran away in the middle of a gunfight, and I got out of it alive. During that particular gunfight, I got hit by grenade shrapnel, and I got the front of my kneecap chipped by a bullet.
And that was the grenade shrapnel in your forehead, right?
And forearm, and bullet, light one on across the kneecap. It all got, the fighting started before we were ready, because Dover walked into the position I was putting him in and just dropped his machine gun, and the enemy heard the clank. We were only maybe 15, 20 feet apart.
Yeah, wow.
So anyway, the shooting started and he ran away. A couple days later, we were on a riverbank, and he actually shot someone who came up over the riverbank, and his gun blew up because he had mud in the barrel. So he was out there without a rifle. I gave him my side. Later on that day, a couple hours later, I told him to go go out on an observation point while we set up a camp for the night. And instead of doing that job properly, he left and came back to get a transistor radio, and it accidentally came on. What he didn't know is that at the time when he left his position on the observation point, he was seen and followed. And so the enemy followed him until they saw our camp in the process of being set up.
Yeah.
And they fired with a machine gun. Now, at the time, I was sitting on a hammock with 2 of my friends. The man next to me got shot in the chest 3 times, and he died.
Yeah.
The other man that you read about, Dover jumped into a hole with the machine gun. He didn't fire the machine gun, and so my friend Joe Rocha thought Dover was dead or hurt, so he jumped into the hole. But on the way to the hole to get the machine gun working, he got shot 3 times in the back, and they came out the front, and one of them broke his arm. But Joe kept the gun working. And then when it was over, he realized that, Dover had been in the bottom of the foxhole with the loaded machine gun pointing in the right direction and didn't do anything, hitting him with a helmet until we got there and pulled him out of the hole and started trying to fix him up.
Wow.
I saw Joe. I saw Joe a year ago at the company reunion. Yeah, Joe lived through it, but when we were putting him in the, pulling him up through the jungle on a jungle penetrator to get him into the medevac helicopter, he got shot 4 more times. This man got shot 7 times because Dover screwed up.
Wow.
So this guy was not. He was not on my Christmas list.
Yeah. And I mean, the obvious lesson, if you're talking to a group of, cadets in the ROTC programs, just, I mean, you got to be able to trust each other in these circumstances. And, Dover obviously didn't come through.
He was he was anything but trustworthy.
Yeah. I wanted to ask another question about your brother. You make an interesting, you say something interesting about your brother. It's something like, my brother was killed in Vietnam, but he didn't die until 2005. Something like that.
No, he lost his life.
Lost his life. Yeah, lost his life in Vietnam, but he didn't die until 2005. But
right.
Can you spell out what you mean by that?
Brother never got over the experience.
Yeah.
They had not invented the term PTS, post-traumatic syndrome or anything like that.
Yeah.
But my brother had nightmares until he died. My brother became an alcoholic.
Mm.
His life was rarely on the upswing after Vietnam. He never got past it.
Do you think was a sense of abandonment part of that? I mean, all the other difficulties you have, you've got the combat, and then, you write about the leeches and the heat and the mud and all this stuff. In addition to all that, do you think this sense of, was there a sense of having been abandoned? Was that part of it as well, do you think?
Well, maybe that was part of the problem, but he knew for sure that his family had not abandoned him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was the only one he would talk to about Vietnam.
Yeah.
Our sisters, no. My dad, yeah, pretty much. But, he didn't live with Dad. Ed and I shared an apartment for a while in the early 70s.
Yeah.
Late 73 on into 74. But, his life fell apart. His marriage fell apart.
Yeah.
And I did not realize until about 73, 74 that he was a serious alcoholic.
Wow. Yeah. And now, was your brother able to, before you actually go to Vietnam yourself, was your brother able to tell you anything about it? Like, here's, this is what's coming your way?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There are things that he told me, little practical hints that I remembered, that I used, and I probably would not have gotten home. For example, he said, when you go to the jungle, you're going to be stinky. Stay that way. You can smell a clean person. They don't smell like the jungle.
Well, actually, yeah, there's that line. I forget who it was, but somebody, and you say he was so clean you could smell him 10 feet away.
Exactly. Another thing my brother told me was, and one of my uncles also told me, this is one of my uncles who was in the Pacific during World War II, and they both told me, if you can manage it in a gunfight in the jungle. Don't shoot twice from exactly the same place. They'll find you and they'll put bullets in you. And there were, I don't know how many firefights I was in, but I do know that there were many of those firefights where I moved just a little bit and bullets came in where I had just moved from. So,
Yeah.
it was, he gave me a lot of helpful information, and I would not have come home.
Wow. It's you're just mentioning these close calls. You were wounded a number of times. Were you ever actually awarded a Purple Heart?
No.
No.
Yeah, you get a Purple Heart if the medics take care of the paperwork.
Mm.
And I guess they just didn't.
Yeah.
And when I left the Army, my main focus was just getting out, getting back to the world, as we used to call it,
Yeah.
and getting back to where I left off. I wanted so badly to be normal. I wanted to have a profession. I wanted a college degree. I wanted a profession. I wanted a wife and family. I wanted to be a normal person.
Yeah.
Getting a Purple Heart, getting awards from the military that I didn't really want to be in anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned in your memoir that your first stint at college didn't go very well. We should say you spent a lot of years as a college professor, so you eventually got the student thing figured out. And both of it were similar in that way. I was not a good student at first, but figured things out. So you're out of college, and then I forget exactly how it goes, but the telegram or the letter arrives that you're going to be joining the Army. And what I'm interested in is because you mentioned, in '68 on a university campus, there's a lot of tension. There's the Martin Luther King assassination, the riots that follow that, the divisions in the country, et cetera. A lot of them related to Vietnam. What did Vietnam mean to you? I mean, was it just something that you would have to do? Was there any sort of idea you attached to it? I mean, if I asked you in mid-1968, what is this thing in Vietnam about? What would you say?
I would say that Vietnam was something that had been on the periphery of my life since I was in the second grade.
Second grade?
Yeah. In 1954, I was 7 years old. I was in the second grade, and we did weekly reports on current events.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
And so me and a good friend of mine named Henry Turner did a report on Dien Bien Phu.
Wow. Yeah.
Because Vice President Nixon wanted to send American paratroopers, but President Eisenhower said, nah, it's not going to happen. Yeah. And we got into that because paratroopers were really cool stuff for little 7-year-old kids, especially if you had older relatives, uncles and cousins and, who were veterans, and my dad was a veteran. And, paratroopers were really cool. And so we did a report on that. Yeah. Now, flash forward to 1968. 1964, my brother joined the Marine Corps. 1967, he went off to Vietnam. And, we had heard about Vietnam, but we didn't pay that much attention to it. It was a faraway place, and hell, I didn't know that much about it. And it became a growing presence in his life for sure. And, he went away. And then in early 1968, the Tet Offensive happens.
Sure.
And that kind of, as I wrote in the book, that event made space in the Army for a lot of draftees, for a lot of people that I called the draft class of 1968.
Yeah, yeah.
So I finished flunking out of Ohio U by June of 1968.
Yeah.
And my brother was home working as a bricklayer. He had finished an apprenticeship, and he had gotten married, and his wife had a baby. So we went to see his new baby and visit his wife, and then we went out and had dinner, a couple of beers, and we went home. And I brought the mail in to my mom and dad's house, and my draft notice was there. It was, like my first niece's birthday, and I got my draft notice. It's like, God, they found me. When you fill out your draft registration card and stuff, you don't really believe that they're going to come and find you personally. There's 220 million people in America. Find me, right? They did.
They got you.
And so I had 2 weeks to go and get ready and go.
Yeah.
I didn't believe until after the physical that I was really going to go. I was held back with one other man for a medical conference, and this guy had a broken pelvis.
Yeah.
He was, a kid, and he walked with a limp.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I had a back condition, so the doctors conferred about him first, and they came out and said, "Okay, my man, you're on the plane. You're going to Fort Knox this evening.
Yeah.
And Gillam will be with you in a minute." So I just got up and I called home and I told my mom, "I'm going to be about 2 years late for dinner. Okay, I'm pretty sure I'm out."
Yeah, yeah. And so in the memoir, you recount your training, the various stages of your training. But let's fast forward to Vietnam, and there are, as I said at the outset, there are some memorable moments in the memoir. One is fairly light, and it's the one titled, I think, Being Overrun or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And light from my perspective, from your perspective, a different thing. But from the reader's perspective, that seems like a fairly light moment. But then there's the other case of the tunnel. So you share the story of you and a few other guys confronting a pack of orangutans and how do you pronounce that word? I'm not even sure how to pronounce it.
Orangutan.
There you go. Okay. Yeah. So confronting a pack of those things in Vietnam. And of course, it's Vietnam vets will tell different stories that you recount at least one big snake, I remember. They're the snakes, and they all talk about the leeches and various things. Could you just recount this story for us?
Yeah, sure. First I want to say that all of the training that I got, and I got more training than the average person who was drafted.
Yeah.
I did basic training, I did infantry training, I did the NCO Academy, I did jump school, I did time in Ranger training. None of those places prepared us for the animal life that we were going to come in contact with. My brother did a lot of training. He was in the Marines for 3 years before he went to Vietnam. No one prepared him for the animals either. He ended up shooting an elephant with a rocket launcher.
Holy cow.
They were using elephants as four-footed trucks to carry supplies.
Down the trail?
Yeah,
Ho Chi
yeah,
Minh Trail.
yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, about these apes, it was Christmas, 1969, and the battalion commander came out to visit us in the field, which we really didn't want to see happen because he was
Yeah.
circling over our position with his helicopter and marking us.
Exactly.
And he walked around to many of the individual fighting positions. And, you know, we know that if anyone is watching, they know exactly where we are. So I was less than gracious in my conversation with him. And after he left, the company commander and my platoon leader decided that somebody with a smart mouth needed to go out on a night ambush. That was me. So me and my squad, all 8 of us, I think we had 8 people then, we went and we set up an ambush in a bamboo thicket. And now I got to also tell you that one of the worst things that can happen to a small infantry unit is to get overrun. You know, we're always worried about that.
Sure. Yeah.
So in the middle of the night, we hear a lot of racket in the bamboo. And, you know, the thing about Vietnam is you sneak everywhere, from rock to bush to tree, whatever. You try not to make a lot of noise. And there's a lot of noise out there. So we figure, okay, it's time to go to work, right? And then we realize, one of the people with me realizes that he's looking at a half-grown or a small orangutan. And we start to relax a little bit, and then this idiot throws a rock and hit the orangutan.
Yeah.
That's a problem. Mom, dad, the whole clan comes down to protect their baby. Understandable. So we got overrun by a bunch of apes.
And they actually started pounding on you guys?
I got 4 cracked ribs.
That's crazy.
I was out of it pretty fast.
Wow.
The ape that hit me was swinging a club and hit me in the side. And when I landed, I was unconscious for a bit. One of the other guys got bit in the thigh. I'm not sure if I got bit either, but I ended up getting rabies shots. So anyway, we got overrun by a bunch of apes, and you know the joke in the company was, oh, there's Gillam and his gorillas, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's by now I've read easily a couple hundred Vietnam memoirs, and a lot of things meld together, but that is certainly one of the memorable stories, the stories that will stick in my mind. There's something else it's a little hazy, but if I remember correctly, you do mention like a 9-foot snake or something.
Yeah.
But if I remember correctly, this is like pretty soon after a firefight, if I remember correctly, and then you've got villagers who now are collecting the snake because they want to eat it. Do I have that right?
It wasn't really the villagers. It was the men from our first platoon. They were out on an ambush patrol.
Yeah.
And we heard on the radio that, they had gotten a gunfight and they were bringing back a prisoner.
Oh.
That was their joke.
Yeah.
So they show up at the fire base with this really long snake. It was, I don't know, boa constrictor, something like that.
Yeah.
And we really considered them as like mobile sausage and something that was different from sea rations, which nobody really liked, So we cut that up and roasted it. It was actually really pretty good.
Okay. That part slipped from my mind. You guys actually ate that thing.
Yeah, it wasn't the villagers. We ate it. There were snakes around all the time. My first week in Vietnam, I got in a bunker, and there was a cobra in the bunker.
Right, I remember you mentioning that.
I couldn't get out of the bunker because we were under a mortar attack. But as soon as that passed, I tossed a grenade in there and blew up the bunker and the snake. And it was a pretty good sized cobra.
You got into trouble, didn't somebody, you got a scolding for that, didn't you, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, the sergeant of the guard on the fire base was really unhappy that I had blown up his bunker, right? So I spent about the next 10, 12 hours filling sandbags and dragging logs around trying to rebuild this bunker.
Yeah. So there are these stories, and from your perspective, getting your ribs busted up by an orangutan, that's no fun. From the reader's perspective, that's sort of an interesting, adventurous tale. Certainly, that story I don't think I'll ever forget, and I'd link it specifically with your memoir. I think another that I certainly will remember, and unlike the orangutan one, everyone will recognize this is a very serious story, and that's the story of the tunnel, when you go into the tunnel. I'm wondering if you would just be willing to recount this. I mean, I was thinking about it, this morning. By now I've talked to so many veterans, and some, as you know, some guys in Vietnam never saw any combat at all. Some sort of experienced combat from a distance. Some say, well, the only NVA or VC I saw were dead, wounded, or prisoner, and never gotten any close contact. Then, of course, you have others who get in these close firefights. But in your case, I mean, this is as close as it gets, this experience you had. Are you willing to recount that story for us?
Yeah. I sent that part of that chapter away to for publication.
Yeah.
It's called Vietnam Magazine, actually. And the publisher of the magazine did a really nice pictorial representation of what the tunnel looked like and stuff.
Wow. Yeah.
So anyway, this is part of what I called the war in the ground.
Yeah.
Of course, the air war and the ground war, but until the late 60s, early 70s, many people did not understand or even know about the war actually in the ground.
In the ground, yeah.
And that was made famous by the exposure of the tunnel complex at Cu Chi, right of Saigon.
Yeah.
There were miles and miles of tunnels all over Vietnam. They'd been there since World War II, and then they were expanded. So my job the job for my infantry unit was usually defined as search and destroy. You search for the enemy and you take his stuff, whatever it was, and you destroy that and you destroy the enemy. So we were on a patrol, and on that particular day, I found a cave that had mortar shells in it and ammunition. And so I booby-trapped it. I put a grenade under one of the cases. And that took care of that. Shortly after we left, someone came in to move the stuff, and they set off the grenade and just blew a big hole in the side of the mountain. We continued on this patrol, and I was the point man. I was frequently the point man.
Yeah.
And I saw tracks in the trail, and I started following those, and I came to a tunnel entrance that had been dug into the side of the hill. And that was part of my job too. It was fairly voluntary. There were a couple times when I just decided, no, I'm not doing it. But anyway, this day I did. So I crawled into a tunnel, probably 100 meters, more or less.
Mm.
And there's some things that you do when you go into a tunnel. One of the things is you don't turn on the light unless you really, really, really have to.
Yeah, yeah.
The second thing is if you're going to go in, if you're chasing someone, you go in there quickly before they get a chance to get to an intersection or, and wait for you to come by, or to set booby traps. And there's all kinds of traps. Sometimes you could find poisonous snakes hanging from the roof.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes you could find pressure plates. Sometimes someone could come through a trap door and stab you with a big spike and nail you to the floor. It just depends. So what you do is you feel in the darkness, you touch as much of the wall and the floor and the ceiling as you can, and then you move forward, and then you keep doing this. And you have to rely on your senses. You can't see, so you listen and you smell. So I got to an intersection, and I thought, okay, this is enough. I was about ready to leave, and I realized I was not alone.
You smelled if I remember correctly, you smelled the fish sauce, basically. There's that fish sauce.
That is really some foul stuff. It's fermented fish mixed with a lot of salt. And anyway, I smelled someone's breath, and I knew they were very, very close. Wow. And I thought about, using my pistol, but then it was snapped in a leather holster. And I just knew for a certainty that if I unsnapped the holster, I would be heard. And so, after waiting a while, we both came together, and whoever this person was hit me in the face, and we started this wrestling match. And I won.
Yeah.
I had intended to use a knife, but when I got hit in the face, I lost it. And so then it was a struggle, just a personal struggle. I came out on top because I was the better wrestler.
You mentioned that in your wrestling career, I think back in high school, if I remember correctly, the coach had you practice wrestling blindfolded or something?
Yeah.
Wow.
His name was Paul Mowry, and he was actually a state champion wrestler himself.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so he had us wrestle blindfolded so that we could feel what a person was doing, rather, and anticipate what was going to happen.
And I mean, obviously, there's no way you could know those skills are going to come in handy.
Yeah.
In the Central Highlands of Vietnam.
Yeah, who knew?
Yeah.
I told one of my friends about this wrestling, and he didn't believe me. So we had a couple of wrestling matches, and I was able to beat him.
Yeah.
Even though he was about 20 pounds bigger than me.
Yeah. You described this incident in the tunnel, and I'll encourage folks to get the memoir and read it. There's just the one question that I have in my mind right now is, it seems that pretty soon after you get out of the tunnel, you are wondering whether it had been a man or a woman. Do I have that right? Because
Yeah.
of course women were with the VC, right? Have you ever resolved that in your mind?
No. It really didn't matter.
Yeah,
I learned early in my tour that no one got a break because of gender.
right.
My very, very first personal combat was with a woman, and I lost. Okay.
Really? Oh, tell me about this. I don't remember this.
Well, we were searching a small camp that had about 3 or 4, bamboo huts.
Yeah.
And I made 2 mistakes in that search. When I got to the corner of the hut, I let my rifle barrel precede me. And so whoever was around the corner, you see,
Oh,
saw the rifle barrel. And it happened to be a woman, a man and a woman. The man was first, and there was a woman behind him. And when I stepped around the corner, this guy was already inside my rifle barrel. So we grappled and I stabbed him. And as I discarded him, I was faced with a woman who had a rifle.
wow.
And I was too close for her to shoot. And her idea was to get out of that small camp as quickly and quietly as she could. She probably preferred not to shoot me because I was hurting other people. Well, what happened was I kind of hesitated. I thought, whoa, female. And by the time I got that thought processed, she had hit me in the face with the butt end of the rifle. And I was unconscious before I hit the ground. But, if you live, you learn from those kinds of things. And I made up my mind right then. Nobody gets a break. Gender doesn't matter. So, I couldn't tell whether this person in the tunnel was male or female. I just knew that it felt like a dead body. And I was happy that I could get out.
You got out.
Yeah.
I mean, this is heavy stuff, man.
Yeah, it was disturbing. It was truly disturbing.
Well, so I asked you a little while ago, what Vietnam meant to you in '68 and, or '68, '69 as you're going in. I'm wondering, what does it mean to you now? I mean, these are, you've got a lot of people went to Vietnam and had very different experiences. I mean, you're in it. I mean, you're in it as much as you can be in it. What is when you look back on that war now? What does it mean to you? Or you can imagine yourself speaking to a group of students. Here's what the Vietnam War. As I reflect back on it now, here's what it means. What
I've done that. I while I was at Spelman, I taught a course on the history of Vietnam.
Yeah.
Well, what it means at this far remove is that I participated in major historical events.
You sure did. There's no question about that.
What it means is I also participated in life-defining events.
No question about it.
Many people who know me, if they were going to describe me, they wouldn't say, that's Jim Gillam, the retired history professor. They would say, that's Jim Gillam, the Vietnam vet.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It was, this was a life-defining thing because the first couple years I was home, people looked at me not as a student returning to college to get his degree. They looked at me as a Vietnam veteran just recently home.
Yeah.
My first significant job, I had when I graduated, my very first job was as a management trainee for Sears and Roebuck.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't like it at all. And anyway, I quit that job and got a job with the city of Cleveland. I applied to be a counselor in a veterans rehab program.
Yeah, yeah.
And instead, they made me the director because I told them during the interview that they didn't have it right. They were not going to be able to serve these people well.
Yeah.
And they hired me to fix it. So, this experience in Vietnam, it defined how I got through college. It defined my first meaningful job. Vietnam led me to pursue graduate degrees in Asian history. Chinese is because Chinese history was Chinese culture was the dominant culture there.
Yeah.
And so I made a promise to a man who was interrogating me that if I ever got home, I would, yeah, sure, I'm going to find out about Chinese history. So anyway, the Vietnam experience directed me through graduate school.
Yeah.
I got hired at Spelman College because I knew about China and Japan. And then as soon as my department chair found out that I had been to Vietnam, he says, "Oh my God, you gotta teach classes about that." And I said, "I don't know enough to do a good course." And he said, "Well, you have a semester to learn." And I said, I don't really, what I know about Vietnam is that the Vietnamese people is that I was supposed to, kill them and count them and move on. And he said, "Well, you got to do a little more than that because you're going to have to teach a course on it." So I took myself to school and got enough together to put a course, to start making a course.
Yeah.
He got me a Fulbright fellowship and I went back to Vietnam. So I added that as part of my academic repertoire.
Yeah.
So Vietnam was life-defining for me.
Well, as we wind down, actually, I wanted to ask you about that. So we're approaching the end here, but you mentioned going back to Vietnam on a Fulbright fellowship, and if I remember correctly, one of the people you meet was you figured out a Vietnamese, a former NVA soldier who had been wounded in an action that you were involved in. So
yeah. My meeting with this man, his name was Mac Duong. The first time I met, Mac was in an ambush in October of 1969. I remember it well because it was my very, very first time doing a night ambush, and I wasn't really sure I was going to survive it. You remember those things.
Sure, yeah.
And we pulled off the ambush. Mac was a scout and guide for people coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And him and his 5-man unit walked into my ambush. My responsibility that night was to shoot him.
Wow.
And I missed. My marksmanship was not really that good anyway. Mm-hmm. So the short story is I missed him. I chased him. I kept shooting at him. I only found his rifle. And I brought it home. I have it in my basement.
Yeah, I was going to ask you still have that.
I do.
Yeah, wow.
20 years later, I'm back in Vietnam, and there's a man giving a lecture on the war from the Vietnamese perspective. And he told us that he had been a scout on the Ho Chi Minh Trail for 6 years, and then he got hurt and he couldn't go anymore. So he became an instructor, and he lived in Haiphong, a port city near Hanoi.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, they wanted more and more, so he got out a map and showed his route, and then he showed the place where he got ambushed. And because I was responsible for picking the place for that ambush, I knew about that place. And then he said he was there October 19th, 1969. And he was the only one to get away. And it just so happens that that's the date I did my first ambush. What are the chances that somebody was at that same place that I picked, the only survivor, and it not going to be him? And he even said that he lost his rifle.
Right. I think you mentioned that. Yeah.
Well, you know what, Mark? I didn't tell him that I was the one who shot him. My roommate on the trip did. And so after the lecture, when he found out who I was, he came over and gave me a big hug, and he took me out for coffee at a Russian coffee house.
Wow.
It became clear that he would not have survived the war had it not been for my poor marksmanship. His arm didn't work quite right anymore.
Yeah. Wow.
And so they made him a trainer, and he survived the war.
Consequently, he survived the war.
Yeah. The next day, he came in and he said, "So Gillam, the first time I met you, you gave me 2 bullets, and I have 2 for you." I thought, oh, God, this is going to get ugly.
Mm-hmm.
He gave me a little trinket cigarette lighter that disabled veterans in Vietnam were making and giving to tourists and things. It was 2 AK-47 rounds wrapped in a brass band, and you pull the top off and there's a little cigarette lighter in there. So he traded me 2 bullets for the 2 bullets that I gave him. It was, meeting those 2 men, those 2 veterans, and having long conversations with them was cathartic in a lot of ways. Ironic, cathartic. General Tran's family died as slave labor on a French rubber plantation.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And he lived in a house, a mansion, that had used to belong to the French commissioner of rubber plantations.
Wow. Yeah.
It was quite a show place. There was a staircase there carved out of a single piece of teak. This is the digs he was living in then. But, he was in the Viet Cong, as they call them, the National Liberation Forces. He was a guerrilla fighter from the early 1950s until the war was over in 75. And, in the conversation, we found out that my brother's Marine Corps unit almost got him in 67, but they didn't. And Tran Van Tra was the man who thought up, planned, and executed the Tet Offensive.
Yeah.
If my brother's unit had gotten him, I might not have had to go to Vietnam.
It's, yeah. It's interesting you put all that stuff together. Just these sort of inexplicable things, these incidents in history. I'm thinking again of the coach, having you practice with blindfolded and just these curious coincidences. It's an amazing story. As you were talking, also I'm just reminded of and I'm just interested in your response to this, and then we can bring things to a close. But you mentioned this officer who's in the fight from the 50s on until the time you wound him, and then he goes into the fight, although in a somewhat safer place up in North Vietnam. The enemy, the VC, the NVA, they were, remarkably tenacious, weren't they?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Most of them never stopped until death took them.
Yeah. Yeah.
They had a job to do. I talked with several of them who had been on the other side, and they said, we looked at you Americans as people who were there for just a minute, and then you're going to go home. You're going to do your 365 days minus hospital time, minus a week for R&R, and you're out. We were in it for life.
Yeah.
This Chinese officer that I met, he was in the People's Liberation Army, and he was an advisor to the Vietnamese. And he said, you all don't understand commitment, Mm-hmm. And Ho Chi Minh said it too. They fought, the Vietnamese fought the Chinese for 900 years. Vietnam used to be a colony, you understand, of China.
Yeah.
The word Vietnam is a perversion of the Chinese designation for that colony, which is called Yuan.
Oh.
In Mandarin means far south.
Oh, wow.
And so there's these people in this far southern colony who fought the Chinese for 900 years. They turned the Mongols around twice, not once. They defeated Genghis and the boys twice.
Well, yeah.
One of those times, they were led by two female generals.
Is that right?
Trung Tri and Trung Trắc. They defeated the second Mongol invasion of Vietnam. These people are not going to give up.
Yeah.
Now, in the summer of, late summer, early fall of 1969, when Ho Chi Minh died, I figured, okay, if I go to Vietnam, I'll be home for Christmas.
Right.
I had no idea about their tenacity and their nationalism. I had no idea.
Yeah. I don't think anybody did. I mean, certainly the country's leadership didn't.
No. And, when I got to the fight, when I was involved on a personal face-to-face level with them, they never gave up. There were a few people who changed sides, etc. But, my last night in Cambodia, I was involved in a personal struggle with one of the men who, actually three of the men who got inside the wire. And this last one, he was clearly losing the fight. And, he knew he was at the end. What he did was he spit in my face before I killed him.
Yeah.
There was no quit in these people.
Wow.
Not one bit.
Wow. Well, Professor Gillam, it's been a real honor. I didn't know honor and privilege. Those aren't the right words. It's just been an amazing experience talking with you. The feeling I have. I mean, this is heavy stuff, and history teacher to history teacher. I mean, just to hear from somebody who was there. I mean, I'll never. It doesn't matter how many veterans I talk to. It doesn't matter how many memoirs I read. I'll never have the slightest clue as to what it was like to be there. But I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing some of these memories. And I appreciate your memoir, and I encourage folks to read it. It's there are a lot of Vietnam memoirs out there. This is a good one, and it's got some very memorable passages in it. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad that you enjoyed it. That's why I wrote it. Just
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
tell the story for me and my guys.